This conference will now be recorded.
All right. Good morning, everyone. So, like I said, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome to the April monthly partnership meeting of the Southeastern Caribbean Disaster Resilience Partnership. My name is Claire McGrath, and I am the director of SCDRP. Thank you so much for joining us today. So, to start us off, I'd like to acknowledge and thank our benefactors and our partners. First off, thank you to the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program and the NOAA Southeastern Caribbean Regional Collaboration Team, or CCART, for serving as benefactors of SCDRP. We're also grateful to our sustaining and supporting partners, IEM, Moffitt and Nichol, and Georgia Tech Center for Sustainable Communities Research and Education. SCDRP is a program of SCORA, the Southeast Coastal Ocean Observing Regional Association. It is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. So if you are not familiar with SCORA and would like to learn more, I encourage you to visit scora.org. So next, I wanted to share a few open funding opportunities available for nonprofits and government entities in our region. At our annual meeting in March, we talked a lot about the need for more funding opportunities for resilience and emergency management around the region. So SCDRP, as a disclaimer, and SCORA are not affiliated with any of these opportunities, but they are listed on SCDRP's website on our funding page. The opportunities listed are all private funding opportunities. So we have State Farm and the National Volunteer Fire Council. They focus specifically on volunteer fire department equipment. The Walmart Foundation has pretty general funding objectives. They mostly focus on smaller grants to specific communities to fill the specific community's needs. Norfolk Southern has several different programs that fund community development, public safety, and resilience. The Neptune Awards are 100K prizes for innovative projects advancing ocean health. So you can go to our website to learn more about these grants, and we also have a lot more available. And we always share funding opportunities in our newsletter. It comes out about once every 2 weeks. So if you're not signed up and you would like to do so, you can go to our website, and there is a button on the top right corner where you can sign up. May is a very busy month for training and events around the region. On May 6th and 7th, the National Integrated Heat Health Information System is hosting a free virtual workshop on heat safety. On May 6th at 11 a.m., SCORA will host a webinar on their data and tools that can be used for decision making as hurricane season approaches. NOAA's Southeast and Caribbean Regional Collaboration Team and NOAA's Gulf of America Regional Collaboration Team are hosting a hurricane awareness webinar series. They do it every year. It's always really great. And they'll share information relevant to the 2026 hurricane season. So they'll cover a variety of topics over the next month or so. On May 20th to 21st, SCORA will be hosting their annual meeting in Atlantic Beach, North Carolina, and registration is closing on May 6th. So again, you can learn about any of these opportunities on our website or in our newsletter. We are trying out a new way to share and request resources and information from the SCDRP network called the Collaboration Hub. So this is a very simple form that you can fill out to share or request information, resources, or opportunities from the SCDRP network. You can scan that QR code. It's also on our website. And as you all know, SCDRP is a unique network in that it includes practitioners from multiple sectors and disciplines. And we're constantly thinking about how best to leverage this network to promote partnership, collaboration, and share valuable information and resources. Through the Collaboration Hub, you can submit resources to share, such as training opportunities or a request, such as a request for a project collaborator. And we'll share those announcements or requests primarily through our webinars, newsletter, social media, and website. And of course, we welcome your feedback as we're trying out this new way to share information. All right, I have one more announcement before I pass things over to our speaker for today. SCDRP committees are now forming. If you'd like to get more involved with SCDRP and build connections with other professionals, joining a committee is a great way to do that. We're currently recruiting for 2 committees. The Partnership Committee is tasked with planning our monthly webinars, helping us connect with new organizations and networks, and expanding our reach in the region. The Development Committee helps SCDRP pursue funding, build our membership, and strengthen and articulate our value. So in 2026, these committees will meet quarterly, and you can email scdrp@socorro.org if you have questions or to sign up. And we're asking for everyone to sign up by May 4th. All right, and next up, without further ado, I'm excited to introduce our speaker today, who I had the pleasure of meeting at the SCDRP 10th annual meeting in Charleston. Antonia Samur is a climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction researcher and practitioner with over 10 years of experience across Latin America, the Caribbean, and the US. She currently serves as a project manager for Columbia University's National Center for Disaster Preparedness and is the founder and principal consultant of Risk Ready Consulting in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Her work focuses on designing and implementing municipal climate action plans, disaster preparedness initiatives for the child care sector, applied research on disaster vulnerability, and community-based resilience strategies. Antonia holds an MA in International Affairs from Columbia University, an MA in International Development from Sciences Po Paris, and a BA in Economics from the University of Chile. So I am very happy to pass things over to Antonia, and I will make you a presenter. All right, you should be able to share your screen now.
Amazing. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I only recently joined the partnership before this year's annual meeting, and I am really excited to be part of it. The people I met during the annual meeting and learning about everything that is being done by the different members of the partnership made me really excited to be part of it and to share what we've done, because I think there's a lot of opportunities to learn from the different work that we have been doing at Columbia, and for us to learn about what others have been doing and ideally incorporate and adopt the good practices and projects that we see all across the region. So thank you, Claire, for the introduction. So as Claire mentioned, I'm going to be talking about 2 projects that I've led through the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at the Columbia Climate School. And these 2 are, first, a project that we are currently implementing with 3 municipalities in Chile focused on climate adaptation planning. And this is a project that we've done in collaboration with 2 other institutions within Colombia and other local institutions in Chile. This is a 2-year project that we are about to wrap up in June of this year. And then the second project I'm going to present is a project that ended in 2024 that was in collaboration with the Department of Family Affairs in Puerto Rico. And it's a project that focused on strengthening capacities for planning and preparedness for the child care sector. So I'm going to start with the first one. So strengthening capacities and civic participation for climate resilience communities in Chile. It's a project that, as I mentioned, we're leading through the National Center for Disaster Preparedness, but we are also implementing with Colombia's Global Center in Santiago. So basically, Colombia has an office in Chile that is meant to facilitate collaborations like these and expand the work and research that Colombia does in other regions, and the School of Architecture and Planning. And then we partner with two amazing institutions in Chile, one of them, the Center for Climate and Resilience Research, part of the University of Chile, and a technical institution called Institute for Disaster Resilience. And so this is a very brief summary of what we've done. As I mentioned, we partner with two leading technical institutions, and then we partner with 3 municipal governments to provide strategic technical support for the development and implementation of local climate action plans. Then together with them, we developed 8 replicable capacity building methodologies that were implemented in those governments, but were also published now, so that any community local government that might find them useful can use them and adapt them. And so through that technical assistance, we directly reach over 250 people through more than 20 workshops. And we developed over 25 sets of specific analysis and recommendations to inform climate action plans. One of the 3 plans has been approved, and we're now supporting its implementation, and 2 of them are in development. We also supported our local focal points in the municipalities' participation at COP30 last year. So a brief overview of the project. So the most important part of the context here is that in Chile, between 2021 and 2022, Chile signed into law 2 very important legal frameworks that dictate risk management, disaster and climate risk management at the local level, and put a lot of pressure on municipalities. So basically in 2021, they approved the new National System for Disaster Risk Prevention and Response, which required now every municipality to develop disaster risk reduction plans and municipal emergency plans, which wasn't a requirement before. So this first legal framework already starting to put more strain in municipal resources, and that required a lot of capacity building that wasn't really there before, because before it was managed at the regional level. And then in 2022, Chile signed into law our climate change framework law, which now required municipalities to also develop climate action plans. And that to say, there was no funding available related to the climate change framework law, and there was some funding available for municipalities with the previous one. And then even though both of these frameworks were signed into law at a very similar timing, and they referred to very similar problems, there was a huge overlap, obviously. There was no legal mechanism connecting the 2 types of requirements and the normative framework. So this, as we were learning about these legal frameworks that were being enacted from Colombia, and obviously I'm Chilean, and I was keeping a close eye on this, I realized that there was no mechanism connecting these 2, and therefore we knew that implementation at the local level was going to be challenging because of that. So some of the legal requirements for climate action plans are conducting climate vulnerability impact assessments, determining specific mitigation adaptation measures that municipalities were going to implement, and obviously monitoring, reporting, verification systems in alignment with other local plans, regional plans, national strategies, and obviously disaster risk management frameworks. And so we looked at all of these requirements, and we were seeing what was happening at the municipalities. And we saw that they weren't really moving at the pace that they were required to move. And so we came up with a project that allowed us to address some of the gaps that we were seeing, which was basically that a lot of municipalities didn't really have proper capacities or teams and tools to do proper analysis of climate data and conduct climate risk assessments, conduct effective community engagement, integrate climate change with disaster risk management, develop local climate funding strategies, and monitor and evaluate adaptation and disaster risk reduction actions. By May of 2025, which was 1 month away from the legal requirement for when municipalities had to have their plans in place, only 6% of municipalities had actually developed their plans. And obviously there weren't enough guides and training programs available for municipal teams. And so we looked at all of this, and then we developed this project that is funded by Columbia Global through Columbia World Project that aims to provide technical support to municipal governments in developing and implementing their climate action plans, supporting community participation processes, promoting the integration of adaptation strategies and disaster risk reduction, and also along with other territorial development strategies, strengthen local climate leadership and promote collaborations, and promote lessons learned and planning methodologies to contribute to ideally other jurisdictions going through a similar process. And so we aim to support the institutionalization of inclusive, integrated, sustainable climate change adaptation plans, and to effectively reduce climate risk through coordination in the implementation of these strategies. So what we've done. The way we conducted this work was, first, we opened a call for applications from local governments, where we received 67 applications from municipal or local governments out of 340 across the whole country. And we selected 3, and then we conducted an initial assessment and planning with them, including a capacity assessment, key stakeholder mapping, and identify the specific technical support priorities that according to each of their needs. And then we developed work plans. And then we spent a year and a half implementing those work plans with them, which included developing methodologies and then implementing it with them. Aside from addressing very specific capacity gaps, we also set up ongoing biweekly coordination meetings with them that we've still maintained, which is basically ongoing troubleshooting and support of everything they need in order to both develop and implement these plans. And this is a quick summary of the type of technical support that we provided. We did climate perception surveys, key actor interviews, community climate change workshops, effective community participation workshops, funding strategies, MRV systems, prioritization measures, etc. And along with workshops that were obviously focused on capacity building for the municipal staff and for other key stakeholders in the communities, we also developed over 25 reports and analysis for specific recommendations for how to integrate certain of these key areas within the action plans. And so here are just some pictures of the work that we did with some of the municipalities. So one of the territories that we were working with is a small municipality, mostly rural, in the Andes Mountain, very close to Argentina. And so one of the key challenges they have related to climate change is water scarcity. And so one of the things we learned very early on was that some of the approaches that the municipality was having before was that they started doing workshops with the communities, and the communities come to these meetings and they air out a lot of their concerns, even if they're not directly related to climate change. And so one of the main concerns there was the effect that mining projects have on water availability. And we would see the municipality trying to tell people, hey, this is not related to climate change. And they would kind of shut off certain concerns that people had that at a first glance didn't really have a direct relationship to climate change. But then we quickly learned that we also needed to continue to build capacities even within the municipal teams to understand just like the systemic scope of climate change and how competing water use by, for example, mining companies did represent an increasing vulnerability for the territory, where now a reduction of the availability of water obviously meant more competition and less availability of water resources for example, agriculture or communities. And so we learned a lot through this process, and we also learned that we needed to continue to build certain capacities even beyond the initial identification of gaps that the municipality had communicated. And then Coquimbo is a coastal city, and so obviously a lot of different types of challenges, a much bigger city. And we also did very similar focus on certain technical areas, plus other additional capacity building and community-based workshops as we identified additional needs with the communities. So some of the results, we developed and published these 8 replicable methodologies, which are basically guides for how to conduct participatory planning activities and capacity building activities, focus on all of these areas that I mentioned before. Surveys, stakeholder interviews, participatory vulnerability and risk mapping exercises, improving community participation strategies for the municipal teams, developing funding strategies, monitoring and evaluating actions, how you prioritize and how you integrate disaster risk management into climate action. These guides are now available for anybody who might find them useful. We actually have them in English now. They haven't officially been launched in English, but it's coming in the next few weeks. But I'm providing a QR code here, and also I'm happy to share the links to the resources after this presentation. And so this is basically like a PDF guide that includes 8 different replicable methodologies that also include links for downloading every one of the tools that we developed in order to implement these methodologies. So for example, if you enter the PDF, you can, from hyperlinks in this document, download PowerPoint, editable, adaptable PowerPoint presentations, evaluations, participant guides, training guides, etc. So they're kind of all comprising in that way. And so just a quick example, the other municipality we're working with, San Jose de Maipo, is within the metropolitan region of Chile, but it's also up in the mountain. They provide, so the Maipo River starts in San Jose de Maipo, and the Maipo River provides 80% of the water to the entire metropolitan region. And some of the climate risk associated in that territory is glacier retreat, drought, landslides, fires, and heat waves. And so they developed their plan, valid for 5 years, led by the Department of Environment, with significant support from organizations and collaboration with our project. And some of the key areas of that action plan are nature-based solutions, obviously strengthening disaster risk management, community emergency planning, education, sustainable tourism, economic development, and water and energy efficiency. So one of the other things that we wanted to do through this project was to strengthen leadership at the local level, to continue to obviously advocate for these issues, that even though there is a law, we know that there needs to be political commitment also at the local level in order to implement them well. And so we took 2 of our 3 local governments to COP in Brazil last year, and that was also amazing to see, because they got to share about their experiences in local climate action. And they also got to meet a lot of people and build international connections and expose them to ideas and solutions at a global level that they hadn't really been exposed to before. We have also been running this webinar series. After we launched our guides in January of this year, there was so much interest from municipal government teams, not only in Chile, but also across Latin America, and also other stakeholders that work with municipalities. We got so many requests for more events and spaces to learn from one another, because over the past 3-4 years, municipalities have all been conducting this process largely on their own. There hasn't been too much support or initiatives that allow them to collaborate and learn from each other. And so after we launched the guides in January with a lot of interest and support from municipalities across the country in Latin America, we decided to do this webinar series, which basically meant like opening up the conversation a little bit about some of the opportunities, gaps, and challenges that municipalities were having around climate action. And so actually our third and last session is today. And we've seen also, regrettably, still so much interest for tools and experiences so they can learn from each other. And I don't mean regrettably in the sense that we don't want them to be learning from each other. We just see that there's still a lot of need for support, for technical assistance, and for spaces like these. And so we're obviously so happy to be able to, through this project, create some of those spaces, but we also acknowledge that this isn't enough and there should be more institutionalized spaces for collaboration and partnership. And so getting to that, we see, so just a couple of like our thoughts around these things is one, the academia government partnership, and the model of co-production of technical guides and research and whatever it is really valuable. I think academia has something very important to contribute here, but sadly we don't see enough academia local government partnerships that allow to bridge some of the gaps that we've seen not only in Chile but also in the US and Puerto Rico, et cetera. So I think this project has proven this partnership to be really great at doing that, at filling like very technical gaps that are often not completely filled by government guidance or technical assistance. And then one of the key issues that we also identified was that the two laws that I mentioned in the beginning, the disaster risk prevention framework and the climate change framework, didn't have any coordination mechanisms integrated. And so municipalities are literally not integrating their plans. They're in the process of developing a disaster risk reduction plan and then a climate adaptation and mitigation plan in parallel, different teams, different participatory activities, without really technical guidance on how to do it and without the normative frameworks establishing like a proper mechanism to do that. And we know this is not unique to Chile. We know that happens here in the US as well, but also this is to us a huge opportunity to contribute to that alignment, at least on the ground, but also identifying these gaps at the policy normative level so that we can advocate for changes and for more robust and sophisticated legal frameworks to be able to continue to build resilience in our communities. And some of the opportunities that we see around this work, and now that we're getting really close to the end of it, at the end of the project, is in line with what I was saying before. There's obviously an opportunity to scale this model. All of the methodologies that we developed are editable, transferable to other municipalities in Chile, Latin America, and the US, facing similar challenges. And so this is one of the things where we don't need to be creating things from scratch. Like there are so many tools and materials available across the board. And I think it's a matter of using maybe networks like this one to share the type of methodologies that have been developed and to use them more widely. Also, as I mentioned as well, expanding on this academia local government partnership for capacity building programs, student engagement, research, innovative funding models, et cetera, I think is really important. So we are definitely trying to find ways to continue to do that through Colombia, obviously building on the experience of this project and obviously other projects that Colombia carries out around these of the same nature. And as I mentioned, using networks like this that are able to create the infrastructure to connect practitioners across different jurisdictions facing similar problems. Okay, so that was the first project. I know it's a lot of information. I would be happy to share this presentation afterwards. So the second project I wanted to present here is a project called Strengthening Emergency and Disaster Planning in Childcare Centers in Puerto Rico, which is a project that we started with another initiative called the Resilient Children, Resilient Communities Initiative. That was a community-based, community-focused resilience strengthening initiative where we started working in Mayagüez and Humacao. And then that grew into an island-wide capacity building project. So I'm sure most of you probably know the context in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has one of the highest child poverty rates in the U.S., which obviously amplifies disaster vulnerabilities. And after Hurricane Maria, we saw that the childcare sector really lagged behind in terms of recovery, which obviously translates into possibly very poor preparedness and planning before the event. And we also know that the COVID-19 pandemic, I think, helped us realize how childcare centers and childcare providers in general are critical infrastructure. Without them, parents can't go to work and communities can't recover. And so we also saw that there was a very heterogeneous level of preparedness and planning in the childcare sector with no robust emergency plans embedded in licensing requirements. The licensing requirements did say that childcare providers needed to have an emergency plan, but it didn't say at all what it needed to contain, what it needed to plan for, or like standards for it. And so we started working with the Resilient Children, Resilient Communities Initiative in 2019, which is an initiative that we developed at NCDP and that we implemented across different states in the US, plus Puerto Rico. So through that initiative, we worked with community coalitions, community resilience coalitions in Mayagüez and Humacao, where we implemented the Community Preparedness Index, which is basically a tool that allows to assess how prepared different sectors related to the care of children before, during, and after emergencies, how well prepared they were to actually meet the needs of children in disasters. And so we basically asked the question, who cares for children before, during, and after a disaster? And so that helped us identify all of the sectors that should be involved in initiatives like this, which included health, education, childcare, obviously, emergency managers, shelters, foster care, etc. And then what do these institutions need to be prepared? We asked that question through that index. And so the application of that Community Preparedness Index helped us identify that in the childcare sector, specifically the childcare providers that were licensed by the Department of Family Affairs, didn't have any guidance that was specific for the childcare sector on how to develop emergency plans and how to better prepare for emergencies and disasters. And so we had been developing this initiative where one of the things that we did was develop this toolbox, which is available both in English and Spanish, which basically contains all kinds of planning tools for individuals and families, for childcare providers, for legislators, and for community-based organizations or emergency managers, which contain a bunch of different tools that anybody can use, adapt, or use as guidance. And so we use that approach to then address the need that was identified through those coalitions. And so through the work that we were doing through that first initiative, through the coalitions, we started working with the Department of Family Affairs at the regional level. And then that led to identifying that that wasn't a problem only at the region, but it was a problem throughout the entire island related to, obviously, a regulation that applies to every childcare provider in Puerto Rico. So we partnered with ACUDEN, which is Puerto Rico's childcare licensing authority at the Department of Family Affairs, to to implement a capacity building program across the island. And this was funded by the PR Block Development Grant Birth to Five, where between 2023 and 2024, we developed a training program that included specific planning tools, which were an emergency planning guide specifically for childcare providers, an emergency operation plan template, which also included MOU and emergency form templates, a risk assessment tool, a continuity of operation plan template, and a COOP planning guide as well. All of these tools specifically developed for childcare providers in Puerto Rico. We also developed a full training curriculum, including an instructor guide, PowerPoints, evaluations, and everything to basically install those capacities at the Department of Family Affairs and at emergency management agencies across the island. And so in 2023, we trained 250 participants across the 10 regions and 60 municipalities, which included the first round of training didn't include any childcare providers, even though we did do some pilots with providers. But the first round was specifically intended to train all of the institutional staff that childcare providers had relationship and like a coordinating relationship with, so that both the staff at the Department of Family Affairs and the municipal and regional emergency managers knew that these plans were going to be in place and that these training resources were in place and the guides were in place, so that they could, obviously, because they're better equipped to do so, they could also continue to provide that guidance to the providers. And then in 2024, we scaled then the training to offer it to every licensed childcare provider on the island. So we basically went across the 10 different regions, and we basically trained almost all licensed childcare centers on the island. These are some of the training resources that obviously were then left and kind of handed off to the Department of Family Affairs, which included, as I mentioned, guides, templates, training guides, etc. So in total, we trained 635 participants across 2 years, including, as I mentioned, childcare center directors, as well as Department of Family Affairs and emergency management staff. The 306 licensed childcare centers that took the training were now equipped with new emergency planning capacities and covered 18,000 children. There was an obvious knowledge gain. Obviously, we used different evaluation tools to make sure that that we were obtaining the results that we expected, where 92% of participants showed significant improvement in their test scores. 98% met all training objectives, 94% of people declared capable of applying what they learned, and 96% recommended the training to others. The institutional training to the Department of Family Affairs and emergency managers basically consisted in training of trainers instances, where we basically handed off all of the PowerPoints, training guides, evaluations to the institutions that were going to be in charge to continue this work. This was a really beautiful project for me as a practitioner standing in an academic institution, because this training program also came along with a change in the licensing requirements. So there was basically a reform in the licensing law for childcare providers, which now included the requirement of using the new templates that we had developed with them, and very specific components of what those plans needed to include. So it basically meant a more robust set of requirements, of legal requirements for childcare providers. Along our work with the department, there was also they created a new Office of Preparedness within the Department of Family Affairs, which is now a permanent structure to support childcare centers in emergency preparedness. So most of the training that we did was mostly focused on that group of 15 or 17 staff that were now in charge of making sure this new law and these new tools were actually being implemented. There was also strengthened coordination between ACULEN and the Puerto Rico Emergency Management Agency. During the duration of the project, we also saw the signing of an MOU between the two agencies that had never been done before, which basically meant that the childcare was now way more visible to emergency management, and they included them in coordination and development of tools, et cetera. So it led to a lot more collaboration and alliances. And also, we helped them develop collaborative agreement templates, which were approved by the legal departments that allowed the formalization of intersector partnerships between the childcare centers and other community partners. And now, coming to an end, some of our takeaways from both of these projects, and then about the role of partnerships like this one, is one, to the last point I was making, how amazing it was to see emergency preparedness initiatives turn into regulation, and how important it is to advocate for those changes in regulation. Otherwise, these initiatives don't necessarily last and aren't institutionalized. And so we learned that through that project. We saw that impact, and we obviously integrate that into everything that we do now, making sure that we're always advocating for the institutionalization of these type of projects. And then the project that we did in Puerto Rico was born from local coalitions. It was communities saying, hey, we see a gap here. And so the power of listening to communities and then having the capacity, the institutional capacity to then scale that up and then go to the state agencies and anybody that will have the resources to turn it into a project that will actually allow to close that gap. I see that as the role of universities and institutions alike that have the capacity to work with communities, to listen to them, and to then go and actually develop tools and resources and programs that actually help address that. And then about the integration of climate risk and disaster risk. We saw, as I mentioned, this was one of the huge gaps that we identified in the project in Chile, but it's also something that a gap that we try to close with the trainings in Puerto Rico. In our trainings about emergency and disaster planning, we included a whole section about climate change and how climate change is changing the frequency of and severity of some of the hazards that communities in Puerto Rico face. And that was really well taken. But we also acknowledge and realize that thinking about integrating climate change into disaster risk management really does require a change in the paradigms that we use, because it requires us to think long term, and it requires us to think about how hazards are changing, and that's not always easy. And then it also requires us to think about slow onset events, not only emergencies, and that also requires a whole change in paradigms. But I think it's our responsibility to help integrate these frameworks, and I know so many people in this partnership and network are doing that. And so about how partnerships like this can help amplify this work, obviously sharing tools and the work that we've done across the network so that others can learn, use it, adapt it, etc. Facilitating peer learning across the US and other nations that share risk profiles, and obviously facilitating partnerships to continue to build on technical assistance projects like these ones for communities that have identified specific gaps and are ready to take on better preparedness in climate action planning. I'm leaving here my email. I'm very open to talking more about any of these projects and finding ways to collaborate with others to share more of what we've done. This QR code is my LinkedIn. Obviously, please reach out. Let's connect. And would be happy to take questions if we have time.
Yes, absolutely. If first of all, thank you so much that you touched on so many important themes and so many topics that I think a lot of us are talking about quite a bit. So thank you so much for such a great presentation. Yeah, we have time for questions. So if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or raise your virtual hand. So it looks like we already have a question. So from Jason Pudlow, sorry if I'm saying that incorrectly, appreciate the mention of slow onset events. For Chile and Puerto Rico, what types of events are the top priorities for each region?
So in Chile specifically, where I mentioned these frameworks kind of acting very separately, where disaster risk reduction plans are kind of meant to address rapid, like sudden events, and climate action plans kind of meant to address slow onset events. Related to the climate change plans of water scarcity and droughts are one of the main concerns and challenges in Chile in most places except for the south, where I think we're going to see an increase of water availability and rain and stuff like that. But the majority of the population of Chile lives between the center and the north. And so, yeah, desertification also, Chile has a big desert up north. And so the expansion of the desert south is also an issue. So many areas that you didn't used to be as arid and desert-like are becoming more like that. And obviously, sea level rise is a problem. The increased temperature of the ocean surface. Also, Chile is a country that heavily depends on fisheries and fishing as an economic activity, as well as agriculture. And so both the changes that are going on in the ocean and the change in productivity of fishing resources and the lack of enough water resources for agriculture are major issues.
Thank you. Jane, I saw your hand next, so feel free to unmute yourself to ask your question.
Great. Thank you, Antonio. Great presentations. I'm curious, in your work in the rural communities of Chile, I know you partnered with local governments, but the key stakeholders, who else within those local communities were you able to engage as key stakeholders typically?
Yeah, it was usually a wide range. Luckily, all three of the municipalities we partner with identified, I mean, not luckily, but for us, because it was part of the work that we actually really wanted to do, was engaging with the communities. And all three municipalities identified that as a gap in terms of their own capacities to engage communities and key stakeholders. And so we made a call for all like community-based organizations like NGO, nonprofits, schools, any academic institution, think tanks and everything, and community members. And so we run like 3 to 5 community workshops in each municipality, where we had really like that wide range of participation. And we also invited all of the municipal staff also to those community meetings, and that was amazing to get like government staff to sit at these community engagement meetings where they don't always sit. It's usually a very small group of people within a local government that lead community engagement activities. But a lot of them that are in charge of implementing laws and programs and stuff aren't really in touch with that. So we basically had like a very wide range, including, as I mentioned, NGO, schools, and all types of organizations.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
All right, we have a couple of questions from Aranzazu. What are your ideas for promoting a framework for risk communication? What products work well for communication? And then what are your views on best practices for communicating climate data and impacts?
Okay, these are not easy to answer questions. um, Promoting frameworks for risk communication, we, I don't know that I have a great answer for it, but what we learned um, through both of our work in Puerto Rico and Chile is that the frameworks that we use to understand risk from our like technical institutions thinking about exposure to hazards and vulnerability as being composed of like sensitivity and resilience or capacity to respond or adapt. These frameworks I feel like are hard for people to understand when we don't talk about them like in very simple ways with like very direct examples. And so I don't think people are not capable of understanding them. Like people are smart. And I think we need to start with that premise. But I think we failed at communicating like how risk is like the components of risk and like what determines risk. And so I think what we learned through doing workshops was that when you explain that and you take the time to like explain these technical terms, like people understand. People are able to, in one session, not knowing anything about like the determinants of risk, then are able to like participate thoroughly in an activity that's focused on helping them identify their exposure to which climate hazards and which are your vulnerabilities. And so I think taking the time to basically distill down some of these technical terms so that people understand how to manage their own risk. Because I think what happens with, at least in the climate change space, I think the way academics and scientists have tried to communicate risk has been very leaning towards telling people exactly what to do, as if there's only like one thing to do. For example, like not eating meat, because like you shouldn't eat meat, and that's like normative because like of emissions. But then people don't want to be told what to do. People want people want to understand the bigger picture so that they can have agency over how they manage their own risk. And so I think allowing people that to understand what determines their own risk so that they can then make better decisions and integrate that knowledge of risk into different decisions that they make about how they build and where they buy a house and I don't know, the different things. And so basically like trying to, in summary, trying to actually communicate risk and how it's actually composed in its components so that people um, can decide how to manage their own risk.
I know you started off with saying that you didn't have a great answer for this question, but I think that was a great answer. And I think that point about starting with the premise that people are smart and they can understand these concepts, but taking the time to distill it down and explain the technical terms is such a good point. All right. So we are almost at the top of the hour. So I just want to thank you again. And to close, I have one more kind of question or comment. Um, I think like something that you touched on quite a bit, which I really appreciated, was the role of academic institutions and other partners to make plans actionable. I know in my own background for a little while. I was managing emergency plans for an assisted living facility for people with disabilities here in Florida. And I had the mandate to write a plan, but it was one thing to write the plan, another thing to make that plan actionable, and able to carry it out. So I'm wondering if, to close, you could just comment on the role of academic institutions or other partners with capacity to help, whether they're local governments or local communities, to make plans actually actionable.
Mhm. Yeah, this is a great question because we're seeing this problem a lot in Chile, where a lot of municipalities actually ended up contracting the development of plan, as it happens, like it's common. Local governments don't always have the time capacities or local skills to do that, and so they hire consulting companies. And we've seen through analyzing some of these plans, and it's like the first time some of these local governments develop these plans and they're developed by external consulting companies, we see that they're actually not too actionable because they don't really integrate specific knowledge and the experiences of people in those communities, in those territories. And I think that's key. And we obviously seen it through like all types of work that we do. The more a plan integrates community perceptions and community perceptions of their own exposure, their own vulnerabilities and risk, and the more it integrates the promotion of what people are already doing as adaptation, as disaster risk reduction measures, the better. Because we know very well that when plans don't integrate communities and community knowledge and local knowledge, projects can actually increase risk or transfer it to other people, transfer it to the future, what we know as maladaptation. And there are so many cases of that. The risk of not integrating communities in plans. And so what I would say is taking the time, and it takes a lot of time and resources, like sitting down with communities and then analyzing data and then understanding how you integrate that knowledge into a plan and how to actually tailor actions and measures according to those perceptions and how feasible it is for people to actually implement and how much people actually want to implement certain things or not. I think that's key. And so taking the time and assigning enough time and resources to conduct participatory planning activities, I think is key.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's a great answer. Again, thank you so much, Antonia, for being here, and for sharing these projects. I think there's a lot that can be applied to, a lot of the challenges that we're all facing. So if you're willing to share your slides, we've gotten a couple of requests, so I will share those and any links that you'd like me to share out with everyone on this webinar, and I'll be posting the recording soon.
Amazing. I'd be happy to share them.
Wonderful. Thank you
Thank you,
again.
Tara. And thank
Everyone
you,
have a
everybody.
wonderful day.